Okay. Next up, we have Amaero International Limited. Amaero's ASX code is 3DA, and it has a market cap of approximately 100 million. Amaero is at the leading edge of advanced materials and manufacturing. The company uses cutting-edge technologies to produce refractory metals and specialty alloy powders for critical applications. Presenting for the company today is Chairman and CEO, Hank Holland. Hank, welcome, and please take it away.
Manny, thank you very much for the time. If you'd go to the next slide, please. Actually, two back after the notes. Thank you. So let me speak at a high level, the opportunity as we see it, and then we'll get through the slides pretty quickly as far as some of the specificity around that. Next slide, please. It's been a very busy 100 days. Pegasus, of which I'm the founder and managing director, led an investment in Amaero in May of 2022. Subsequently, we fully underwrote an entitlement offering in December of 22. What I think is unique about this opportunity is twofold. A is as an active investor, $1 billion in this business. We own 39% of the registry. A bit more than half of that is my personal capital and our personal shares. The opportunity and the reason that we chose to pursue this is highly strategic and not particularly economically dependent, as we will talk about here in a moment. Next slide, please. It was 1 year ago exactly, November 1st, 2022, that Amaero announced that I would step in and take over as chairman CEO and that we would lead the next financing round. It looks like maybe it's just the names on my side of the page here are cut off. But over the last 52 weeks, you'll see the company has advanced the stock price about 180%. During this time, we know the backdrop has been a very difficult market for the ASX as well as the small ordinary indices. ASX flat, ordinary indices down about 7%. Next slide, please. If you look at the nature of what we're doing, the reason I say this is so highly strategic, Pegasus in general is invested in highly thematic investments where we feel there's an asymmetrical outcome and where we feel we can actively get involved and have a clear line of sight to a catalyst to create value. In the case of Amaero, as you may well know, in the aftermath of COVID and the Ukraine conflict, there's an effort underway to address the vulnerability that we have in the US and certainly elsewhere in the Western world, given the offshoring that we did of critical capabilities, advanced manufacturing, critical minerals, defense protection in particular. And in fact, to reshore these capabilities and to shore up our most basic primacies in the US. Next slide, please. This is really the opportunity for us. Amaero spun out of Monash University in 2013, went public in December of 2019, had planned to build a relatively small facility in Victoria. When I got involved on the board, we felt that it was a less than suitable site, less than adequate scalability of that site, and thus have announced about 100 days ago, as this 100-day pipeline, if you will, or timeline of events began, that we would relocate the business to Tennessee. As you may be aware, in the southeast of the US, it's really the heartland of the renaissance that's going on in manufacturing, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia. To attract us, we're moving into a 300-acre dedicated, if you can imagine, 140 megawatts of power has already been installed in a dedicated substation. We've signed a 10-year agreement with subsidized electricity, and they built this building on a spec basis, which was finished about 3 weeks after we signed our lease. Saved us 12 to 18 months as far as getting to market and about $22 million of working capital. We will begin in state-of-the-art atomizer, which essentially turns bar into powder used in the most advanced applications of 3D printing. We'll begin that installation in February, March, April timeline. We'll be producing powder the back half of next year. Next slide, please. Tennessee is a big deal for a number of reasons. I mentioned the thriving manufacturing renaissance that's occurring there, but not only that, Tennessee Valley Authority enabled us to have subsidized electricity rates for a 10-year period of time. Oak Ridge National Lab, which is a premier national defense lab in the US, is just down the highway, of which we've begun a collaboration agreement with. Got a strong aerospace and defense ecosystem in the Tennessee Valley area, both Tennessee as well as Huntsville, Alabama. Next slide, please. Perhaps the most significant thing that we've done, I announced in July and August, I feel that we've now stood up the strongest team in the industry. Eric Bono, joined by the bottom two pitchers, Fred Yelton and Dave Schmidt, have worked together for the better part of 20 years, have been innovators in the space of powder metallurgy. In the case of Fred Yelton, literally invented the gas atomizer for titanium. In the case of David Schmidt, one of the foremost experts at computational fluid dynamics and numerical modeling. And Eric, both on the commercial side, the technical side, and the operational side. As you may be aware, Berkshire Hathaway's largest acquisition ever was a company called PCC, Precision Cast Parts. Jay Chandran, who you see in the middle there on the right, oversaw 2 greenfield manufacturing operations. We hire him to oversee the fit out of the building, installation of the equipment, and running the operations as well. Very, very strong team. Next slide, please. This is the essence of the opportunity, and very exciting what we announced recently. And you've seen just over the last 100 days about 100% increase in the stock price. And yet I would argue much of this news is not yet reflected in the stock price. As you may be aware, China and Russia have a dominant advantage in hypersonic technology, which has created a significant vulnerability for the US and allied countries. This is priority number 1, priority number 2, priority number 3 in the US DoD and our prime contractors. And as you see on the left-hand side, a study that was commissioned by the US Air Force, the principal impediment to commercialization of this technology is our supply chain, and particularly the supply chain for critical materials, advanced materials, notably refractory metals, such as C103, which I'll touch on here in a moment. On the top, you see of any of the top tier primes, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, you will invariably hear them speaking at the front part of the call about their hypersonic development and how this will be driving earnings for decades to come. This positions us at the forefront of this technology rollout. Next page, please. The atomizer, as I mentioned, the second in the world of which we have commissioned. The first is currently operating in Germany. This will be the first to be installed in the US, and it's a significant improvement from the prior generation of what's called electrode inert gas atomization, or IGAs. Prior generation of the total powder one produced, about 20% of that was the highest value powder bed fusion grade or spectrum powder. We're actually achieving north of a 50% yield, so it's better than a 2-to-1 productivity increase. But importantly, also, it enables us to create powder of high temperature refractory metals, such as C103, which is made up of niobium, hafnium, and titanium. And this is used in high temperature applications, such as hypersonics, propulsion systems, leading edge, if you will, and also used in space. Since we made the announcement we would be dedicating our first atomizer to C103, we have received numerous unsolicited inbound calls from national defense labs in the US, as well as commercial primes, looking to arrive at essential commercial relationships to get offtake and to get exposure to the C103 that we will be producing. It's hard to overstate the significance of this from a strategic standpoint and where it places us in the supply system. By way of comparison, by the way, titanium 6-4 sells for about $180 US per kilogram. C103 sells for about $2,000 US per kilogram. So shifting to C103 materially accelerates our free cash flow break-even, as well as materially accelerates the realization of our revenue goals. Next slide, please. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions, Manny. Thank you very much.
Hank, thank you very much for that. Very interesting industry. There are a few questions that have come through. I'll just start with it's a pretty simple one, I guess. What are the technical advantages that Amaero has versus others in this space? So what's your key competitive advantage here?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I touched on one of those, which is the equipment itself. As I mentioned, our atomizer is the next generation atomizer, only one other in the world. We're about to order The next atomizer, which will be the third produced in the world, will be the second installed in the US. So that's the first piece of it. The second piece of it, I would say, are the people, the operating team that we've stood up. And you saw the stock price respond to this earlier this summer. Certainly, this is a significant part of the inbound interest that we're receiving. This is the team that is proven. Literally, Fred Yelton invented the atomization technology for titanium, as well as Eric Bono is very well known in the industry. Beyond that, what I would say, there's other very capable companies that are producing powder, such as, for example, well, I won't mention a name, but large companies in the US. One of the principal distinctions, though, is for these companies, powder is a very, very small part of their business. Perhaps it's 1%, 2%, 3% of their revenues. And on top of that, the nature of these large industrial companies is they have very large production runs. So this particular company that I'm thinking of, if you were to call them and put in an order for C103, they would quote you about 2,000 US per kilogram, and they would give you a 24-month delivery schedule. The US Air Force does not have 24 months. The priority of this initiative, particularly around hypersonics, is urgent, and it's now. And the fact that this is the principal competency, the core focus of Amaero, is very differentiating from the larger industrial businesses, of which this is but a small part.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next question is around, there's some inquiries around a little bit more detail as to who your key customers are or likely to be, and what, at this point in time, who would be your largest?
So right now, albeit we do have revenue, I really think this is pre-revenue. The company spun out of Monash University in 2013, and a lot of the work that we've done to date has been commercialization. So it's been doing technology development for first-tier primes such as RTX, or the former Raytheon, or companies such as Gilmore Space in Australia, or Boeing, or so forth. On the powder side, our first atomizer, as I mentioned, will be installed in February. We'll have powder and revenue the back half of next year. So essentially, we're pre-revenue in the main part of our business. Who our customer is, at the end of the day, the ultimate customer is one. It's the U.S. government. Of course, the way we get to the U.S. government from a procurement standpoint are the first-tier primes I mentioned, such as a Lockheed, a Northrop, an RTX, all of whom we have commercial relationships with. They're first-tier suppliers, companies such as Castheon that are very active in the refractory space. But where you'll likely see the first commercial agreement signed, and I alluded to this at the AGM, I'm actually in Australia this week for AGM that was on Tuesday, is we're working closely with the National Defense Labs in the US and research labs such as Air Force Research Lab, one might imagine. And so when you look at our first offtake agreements, look not only at the quantum, and I mentioned this again at the AGM, but very importantly, look at the counterparty, where we will sit as far as the locus between development and commercialization of these technologies.
Right, that's pretty clear. Thank you. And the next question is coming from an investor asking whether your intention, given that you've now closed down the Australian business, is your intention to remain on an ASX listed company? Is that your natural spot? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a natural question. So I am a U.S. domiciled investor. I do have a very successful track record of buying businesses, creating value, and monetizing that value via M&A activity and so forth. This is a highly, highly strategic business, and it is a critical capability within the U.S. defense ecosystem. Today, the right place for us to be is ASX. I would never have listed a company this small and this part of its growth stage in the U.S., this market cap. On the other hand, we are already receiving unsolicited outreach from U.S. private capital sponsors, private capital sponsors or private equity firms, if you will, as well as strategic investors. I think in the immediate future, call it calendar year 24, calendar year 25, I would hope and expect to remain on the ASX. The real question will become, as we create value, and in the private equity domain in the U.S., they have a perspective on what that value is. Do we continue to re-rate on the ASX, or is there an arbitrage, right? Does the ASX essentially undervalue us from where other market participants would? And I think that will largely determine at what point a transaction would occur. But for now, we expect to remain on the ASX.
Great, thank you. And this leads us to the last question for you today. And it's a question around balance sheet. I mean, what is the current status of your balance sheet? Are you comfortable that it is in a strong enough state to help you deliver on the plans that you have for the company going forward. Some of the ones that you've outlined, in terms of some of the building that's going on at the moment. Is it in good shape? Do you have the cash necessary at the moment? What is the status?
Yeah, thank you, Manny. Over the last year, I think investors that have followed this business have found that we've been very transparent and try to be very direct with investors with our communication. We finished the most recent quarter with 5.4 million cash on our balance sheet. Our current burn rate from an operating standpoint is about $1 million per month. And what we've said to investors over time is in calendar year 24, we expect to need about $40 million US, call that $60 million Australian, for OPEX and CAPEX in total. Unlike the mining projects or other growth projects, we will then be fully installed, and we would expect to be free cash flow positive from that point going forward. As a 39% shareholder, one of the things that I am very, very mindful of is how do we provide that adequate growth capital over time, maintain a strong balance sheet, and yet do so in a way that minimizes any dilution to our shareholders, including, of course, myself. And this is front and center of our mind. I do expect that we'll go out in a very thoughtful way and raise that capital, much of which will be equity capital, some of which could be equipment financing, debt capital, of which we've got a deeper, more mature market in the US.
Great. Thank you, Hank. That was fantastic. Thank you for your time today, and have a great weekend. Hope to see you back soon.